A couple of weeks ago, I reviewed this. It's the Nanook S, and I was pretty impressed by it then. I think it's an incredible looking premium case for a high-end build. And at the end of that video, I said I really wanted to check out the larger 16-liter size to see how it would compare. And Thorazone was actually nice enough to send it over, so this is it right here. It's the Nanook R. Now, in that previous video, I pronounced the name wrong the entire time. It's correctly pronounced Nanook and not Nano-Q, which actually means polar bear if you're curious. Okay, so anyways, what's the difference here? Well, for starters, it's larger. We have that 5-liter difference between the two, so it's closer matched to the M1 Evo or the Dan C4, whereas the S is closer in size to the T1 or the Dan A4 H2O. Now, both of these are mini ITX only, but with that extra size means more cooling potential. It's got a slightly easier build process, and of course you can fit larger components. The smaller 11-liter S I have here is in the carbon color, which is really just black, and I think the colorway looks exactly as you would expect it to. And with the R I have graphite. It's a bluish gray color, and I think it also looks really nice. That blue tint is more prominent than I was expecting from the renders, and it definitely shows more depending on the lighting, but still, I think it looks really nice. It's a unique color that I haven't personally seen before on a case. All right, so let's open this guy up and see what it's actually like to build in. On the top here, there are these 7 panels. Each of them have some utility to them. The center one here has the branding and power button. The outer 4, they pop off magnetically, and underneath that you can find the fan mounting points. And then the 2 directly outside of the center, those ones slide up to unlock the outer shell so that you can slide the whole thing off. Now inside is the accessories box that has each of the individual screws surrounded in foam. It's a really nice touch that adds to that premium experience here, which I do actually really appreciate. Like I said in the Nanook S video, it's a super minimal design on the inside. We have a few steel rods that run across to connect the front and back panels that then are cut out to be flat on one side so that you can easily mount your radiators or your fans on one side and then the light rays on the other, which is actually where I'm going to start this build. So I learned the hard way in the S that it's much easier to install these light rays and the handles before we put in any components. Both of these accessories are additional add-ons, by the way, so you can pick those up along with your case if you're interested. All right, so now with those attached, the top bar and the short one in the middle, those have a few points to add the motherboard standoffs. So I'm gonna attach those and then drop my prepped motherboard in. Now, if you are curious, I'm using a 7800X3D. That's plugged into an Asus X670EI with 32 gigs of RAM. I'm using DDR5 6000 here, and a 1TB 980 Pro SSD. So now let's drop that in and secure it into place. And I gotta say, I really love how open it is in here. The case just kind of gets out of your way when you're building, and it makes it very easy to work in. Now, these 2 bars on the left of the motherboard, those are for the power supply unit. You can fit up to an SFX-L power supply in here, but I'll be using the Corsair SF750. So you won't be able to use the regular screws that come with your power supply. There are 6 longer ones that are included with the case that can reach through the rod and secure it. I also have some custom linked cables that were sent over to me from Bespoke Baka, so a big thanks to them, and I'm just gonna plug those in now. So let's not forget to plug in our front power button and the light rays. And then on the bottom side, you can fit up to a 280mm radiator or 2 140mm fans. Now in my last build in the Nanook S, I went with an AIO and I was pretty happy with the results. This time I kind of wanted to try something different and go air cooled. Now, sandwich style layouts like this one are pretty limited when it comes to CPU cooler height, but just like the Fractal Terra and the Form T1, this case has the ability to adjust that center spine. So that helps add a lot more versatility into your component selection. Now, because this is the first time I'm working in this particular case, I'm gonna save the CPU cooler installation for last because I know what GPU I want to use, but I'm not entirely sure on how much spacing I'm gonna have once that's in place. So for now, I'm just gonna install those 2 140mm Noctua fans on the bottom. Now, Thorazone includes 4 long screws and bolts to attach these, so your standard fan screws are gonna be too thick to make it through the mounting holes. But I do have to say, these are kind of a pain in the ass, and there are only 4 included, which means I'll only be able to use 2 screws for each fan. Now, besides those being annoying to install, it's been a pretty breezy process so far. Now next, I'm gonna install the PCI Express riser cable, and once that's plugged in, you can wrap it over the top bar and then down to the mounting points. So I'm gonna be installing the Asus TUF 4070 Ti Super. So this is a pretty thick card, it's 3.25 slots. And my thought process here is that even though I know I'm gonna be more limited on CPU cooling space with this thicker card, I think that a lot of people who would be going for the R over the S will probably want to use a bigger card. And so I still think it'd be interesting to see what we can get away with for air cooling with a large card like this. Now, if you want to see more about the 4070 Ti Super, I actually did a review on it last month when it launched. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested. Now, in this pre-production unit, there's only one mounting point other than the riser cable, and that is by the GPU fingers. So let's remove this thumb screw and then slot the GPU into place. Again, I gotta say, I do really like the openness of this case when you're building in it. There's really nothing in the way, even when installing this giant GPU. Now that we got that slotted in, we can plug in the power connection. I've talked about this already in my previous videos, but with that single mounting point, the GPU is pretty loose. They already have a fix for this on the production units, but for now, I'm gonna zip tie the end of the card to one of the rods so that I can prevent it from moving around when handling the case. So now that the GPU is installed, I'm gonna loosen up the spine and shift it towards the GPU side so that I can get as much of my CPU clearance as possible. Now, I also noticed that when you're shifting the spine, there are some specified positions for a few of the screws. Now, if your component choices put you somewhere between them, you won't be able to fasten all 6 of those positions. I was still able to fasten 4 of them, which still feels pretty secure. And so far, that's been working out fine. So I was hoping to be able to fit an L12S in here, but it's actually not looking like there's enough room. So I'm instead gonna pivot over to the L965. Now, this should be enough to cool the 7800X3D at stock, but it's not gonna leave any headroom for overclocking. But luckily, the 7800X3D is a very efficient CPU anyway. So if you're planning on running a hotter chip and want to go air-cooled, you might wanna consider a smaller card, and that should leave enough room for the Noctua NHL12S. I also want to install one more 140mm fan at the front. Now again, the mounting points for that are under the front panels, but there is a problem. Remember earlier when I mounted the other 2 fans and then I said that there was 4 screws and bolts included? Well, I used them all, so there's no more left to mount this front fan now. Except I was lucky enough to be sent over both the S and the R, which means I can grab the screws from that case and use it here. But almost nobody else will be in that position. I'm hoping that Thorzone can include a few more screws to cover anyone else who wants to go air-cooled. Okay, so the last thing to do here is to add the dust filters, which magnetically attach to the inside of the cover. So now with all of that complete, it's finally time to attempt to put the cover back on. Something I noticed here is that it was significantly easier for me to slide the cover back on in this build than it was the S. Now the S I had pretty packed, and the cover would snag on the AIO tubes, but it would also rub on the riser cable. In the R, it's not rubbing on the riser cable or really anything. So just something to keep in mind, if you have a really stuffed build, it can be a chore to get inside it if you need to. Otherwise, in a simpler build like this, it is so much easier. All right, with everything put together, let's test out some games. Now looking at Cyberpunk 2077, I'm using an ultra-wide 1440p resolution, and I've got this at the ray traced ultra settings. And yeah, look, this tiny cooler is keeping up with the 7800X3D. We've got the CPU in the mid 70s and the GPU at or below 70. Those 140mm fans are definitely helping out here, but they are adding to the fan noise, of course. I'm measuring it at 44 to 45 decibels, and I'm using a standard fan profile. The finals is seeing similar temperatures as well, with the CPU in the mid to low 70s and the GPU in the low 60s. So gaming temps and noise levels are looking absolutely fine. But I did notice when doing other CPU intensive tasks, the temps would go up into the 80s and the fans would ramp up as well, where they were much more audible, around 50 decibels. Now, I still think it's interesting to see the air cooling performance here, but I would honestly recommend going with an AIO instead. I think that makes more sense in a case like this, or if you really want to go air cooled, then to go for like an L12S with a slimmer graphics card. Still, that little Noctua cooler is very impressive, but I think I'll save that for a smaller build where a 280mm AIO is not an option. So Thorzone, they sent these units out to reviewers to get an idea of what needs to be improved. I talked about a few issues I came across in my last video with things like the additional GPU mounting point, things like that. So I won't really repeat myself here, but one thing I did notice is that in vertical mode, the S had some wobble if you pushed it. And as I said in that video, I wouldn't really move my furniture around with it on top, but as far as normal use goes, it seemed fine. With the R, when it's fully built, it feels much more sturdy than the S did. I feel like I would have to intentionally push it over to make it topple. Even still, I do think it would be a good idea to add some additional feet, maybe something that you could clip onto the handles so that it covers more surface area and adds more stability. But Thorzone has been really great at taking everybody's feedback. They've applied it all to production units and they have a whole list of changes coming. So I am very excited to see how that final product actually looks. But anyways, that's really all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.